I am making a game about card tricks, and I want to add this technique to my game. I want to add this specifically because it's fun. It feels satisfying, and it's perfect for a cool and compelling game mechanic. I've actually already added it, and this is what it looks like. It's not very satisfying, but there's one thing that I've been thinking about which I think will elevate this a little bit, and that is to add depth. The entire scene is completely flat. There's nothing to indicate that there is a third dimension. There's no shadows, there's no perspective, it just looks flat. The irony of 2D games is that game developers will spend hours and hours trying to figure out how to add depth to their 2D game to make it look slightly more three-dimensional, because when games look flat, they just look bad. I want to use a worse word than that, but I don't want to be punished by YouTube. Depth is also important for the feel of the game. Not literally, but the way that the player perceives the character that they are controlling and like the world around it. For example, in my game, the technique that I'm trying to add, the cards are literally falling from one hand to my other hand. The gravity and physics, I guess, of me like bending the cards and springing them to the other hand is what really happens. And this kind of happens in my game, but there's no real way to perceive the depth and like the cards actually falling. What if I was to drop the cards? How would I know? I want it to have more weight and impact to make it more believable. In this video, I'm going to show you 3 different ways I've added depth to the game, and the first is shadows. Shadows in 3D games are usually pretty complicated. There's 100 different ways of doing it. It requires lighting, you need to make sure it's well optimized. It's a pain in the ass. I should probably use some nice shader to create shadows for my game, but for the time being, I'm just going to draw the scene twice. The first draw of the scene will be the shadow map, so it'll be all the sprites that cast shadows. We'll bring all of the colors down so the shadows are black, and then bring the opacity down so they're softer. We've drawn the shadows, but the problem is now we can't see the shadows because we're going to then draw the sprites on top of it. So all we need to do really is add an offset. And this works. It looks like the light's coming from the top left, the shadows are casted down to the bottom right. It does work and it looks like a shadow, but we can go further, which will then bring me into my next technique, and that is perspective. Right now my game has an orthographic 2D perspective, which means the scale of the sprites doesn't change. So what we can do is add perspective, a sort of hybrid perspective to the game by making the sprites grow bigger as they get closer to the camera. This is actually really easy to do. All I need to do is tie the Z position of my sprites to the scale of the sprites. So as I move the sprite along the Z axis, you can see the sprite actually getting bigger. We can also link the shadow offset to the sprite Z position. So as the sprite gets closer to the camera, the shadows move further and further away. Now, if we tie everything together, it really helps the perception of depth for the player. The third and final thing that I'm going to talk about in this video is shaders. Shaders will solve your life problems. Using a shader kind of feels like you're cheating because they just do everything really well, really efficiently. No matter what you're trying to do, chances are you'll probably be able to find a shader that will do it better and faster and harder than you can do it any other way. I wanted to add a background to my game, and I was trying to I drew some different sprites. They all look kind of weird and not very good. I found a shader and it looks so much better. It looks so much better than anything else I could have done. I wanted to add a vignette, and I thought, hey, I could just draw that in Paint, I guess, and just draw it on top of the screen. Nope. Just use a shader, man. It looks better and it's probably more efficient. I wanted to add an effect at the end of a trick, so when you finish the trick, it's sort of like an elaborate display at the end. And what do you know? There's shaders that can do that. So what I did was I added a shockwave effect. This is pretty simple. It's a cool effect that sort of adds more depth to the background. It looks like it's rippling as you finish the trick. Shaders, man, they just work. What I really want to do with my game is manipulate the cards in a way that looks realistic and believable. And a lot of tricks, like for example the one I'm adding, you have to bend the cards, right? Like that. So this trick, you just bend it and the cards spring. So I could try and figure out a way of like drawing the texture to a mesh and then manipulating the mesh vertices manually, or I can just use a shader. We're going to use a shader. They are just kind of like magic. I spent 5 years in university. I did a lot of graphics programming. I still don't really know how shaders work or how they do stuff, but I think it's magic. I've got this shader now that I can use to manipulate the vertices in the cards. So I want to be able to flex the card like I said. I've got a shader that does that. All I need to do is draw the texture to a mesh, and that's really easy. The shader does the rest of the work. We can see the actual triangles that are being drawn and how they move and change. And you can just look at this card flexing. It's beautiful. I'll stop nerding out about shaders, but we can see this, I feel like, adds more depth to the scene because the cards look more 3D when they're flexing like that. Now we can put the shader into my trick. So when we pick up the cards, we flex them. And I had to draw some new sprites for the hands. But it is what it is. I'll make it better later. That's what I keep telling myself. It's going to look better later when I either pay someone or I learn how to do art. As long as I can use shaders. Maybe I could use a shader to draw my art. I don't know. Fucking who knows. But the cards can be flexed. So I pick up the cards. The hand flexes. The cards spring to the other hand. And it looks pretty cool. It looks satisfying. It's got depth. And it looks more three-dimensional. So I think the player will now be able to perceive that the cards are closer to the camera, and then hopefully they'll sort of be able to understand that the cards can be dropped. Bringing all of these techniques together adds depth, but also what we call in the biz player embodiment. The hands that the player controls in the game feel more tangible because of the tricks I've used to create a 3D perspective, or a hybrid perspective, I guess. So this makes everything more believably real. Adding the perception of depth strengthens the idea of like cause and effect. So when the player springs the cards fall and they have to catch the cards before they fall too far. If you have any other ideas that I could use to add more perception of depth, then please let me know. Always happy to learn and add things, and games development is a collaborative process, so let's just work together and let's finish this game, please. I want to finish it. Please subscribe to my channel if you are interested in more stuff like this. I'll be putting out videos as much as I can, and I'll see you guys later.